My name is Arnold Murdoch. I turned 81 this past November, though it doesn't feel like it, except when my knees lock up in the morning or the cold stings my fingertips like little electric shocks. I've lived in the same small house in Rochester, Minnesota for over 40 years, ever since I bought it with my late wife, Darlene. Back then it seemed enormous, almost extravagant. 3 bedrooms, a fireplace, a little fenced yard out back that Darlene filled with hydrangeas and basil every spring. It's quiet now, too quiet. Darlene's been gone 5 winters already. Cancer took her fast. So fast we didn't even have time for denial. She was diagnosed in February and gone by June. I still sleep on my side of the bed. Out of habit or respect or superstition, the left side is hers. I don't let anything touch her side of the mattress. I don't wash her pillowcase. I don't care how it smells. It's the only scent of her left. People say grief fades. It doesn't. It settles, like snow. You stop sinking, but you never feel quite warm again. Darlene was the glue. After she died, my world unraveled in quiet ways. My son, Jason, used to come around once or twice a week. He'd bring groceries, check my medications, tighten the screws on the cabinet hinges. But after the funeral, his visits stretched out like a rubber band. First, once every 2 weeks, then monthly, then only holidays. Now it's nothing unless I call him first, and even then, it depends on whether he picks up. Jason's wife, Sharon, never liked me. Too old-fashioned, too quiet, too stubborn. She once told Jason, loud enough for me to hear, that I was emotionally constipated. I laughed. Darlene would have laughed too. Sharon's not a bad person, just impatient and practical. She wants control over her life, and I'm not a neat part of it. I don't fit into her systems, too slow, too analog. Jason is 52 now, a software engineer who works remotely most days. They live about 20 minutes away in a large modern house with an open floor plan and motion-sensitive lighting that always confuses me when I visit. I hate those kinds of houses, so sterile, like a museum or a surgery suite. Their fridge doesn't even make noise. It just hums like it's whispering secrets. My grandchildren, Ava and Noah, are 12 and 10. I hardly see them. I used to babysit them twice a week when they were toddlers. Now they barely look up from their screens when I'm there. Once I asked Ava how her piano lessons were going, and she just said, "Fine," without looking at me, her thumbs dancing across her phone. I can't blame them. I'm not interesting. I don't know TikTok. I don't say the right words. I move slowly and forget the names of cartoon characters. Since Darlene died, I've tried to keep up the routines that used to anchor our lives. I sweep the porch every morning, even if there's nothing there but dust and dead leaves. I keep her knitting needles in the drawer, just as she left them. Her last project was a baby blanket for a neighbor's niece. The unfinished square of soft green wool still sits folded on the armchair, needle tucked neatly inside. I tried to donate it once, but I couldn't go through with it. It felt like deleting something holy. My days are quiet, and I suppose I should be grateful for that. No wars in my neighborhood, no sirens, no arguments through the walls. But silence is its own form of violence. When you've spent your life in the company of someone who filled the air so effortlessly. Darlene used to hum as she folded laundry. She tapped her fingernails on tabletops when she was thinking. Even her sighs had rhythm. Now the house makes only mechanical sounds, the ticking of the ancient thermostat, the grumble of pipes when I run hot water, the intermittent groan of my knees when I rise too fast from a chair. Some mornings I sit at the kitchen table for 2 hours, eating the same slice of toast slowly, rereading the same news headline 5 times. Not because I'm senile, because there's no reason to hurry. I've become methodical in everything. I slice apples in perfect eighths. I measure coffee grounds by weight. I write grocery lists in alphabetical order. When your world shrinks, these small rituals become acts of survival. I'm not broke, though I live like I am. I receive a modest pension from my decades with the Postal Service and have some savings that Darlene and I built up over the years, mostly untouched, except for occasional dental emergencies and the time I had to replace the boiler. Jason once offered to set up an automatic financial monitoring system for me. I declined. What he meant was, give me access to your accounts, Dad, just in case. But there's always a cost to just in case. I've seen what happens when older people surrender too much too early. I'd rather drop dead with dignity than fade into a dependency I can't reverse. It's not that I don't trust Jason. He's my son. I held him the night he was born. I cleaned vomit from his hair when he got the flu in 7th grade. I drove 200 miles in a snowstorm to watch him receive his master's degree. But he's changed, or maybe he's just become more of who he always was. Impatient, defensive, always believing he's the smartest one in the room. When I try to talk to him about anything real, Darlene's birthday, the ache in my back, the dread I feel every time I go to sleep, and wonder if I'll wake up alone again, he changes the subject, says things like, "Let's stay positive, Dad," or "You should get out more," or "Have you considered group therapy?" As if loneliness were something I could unsubscribe from. This past Christmas, they didn't invite me over until the 26th. Jason said the kids had a lot going on, and Sharon was hosting a work Zoom party. When I arrived the next day, the tree was already stripped of ornaments. Ava was at a friend's house. Noah barely glanced at me. I gave them envelopes with gift cards because I don't know what kids want anymore. Jason thanked me without opening his. Sharon was polite in that icy way she reserves for polite people she doesn't like. We ate reheated ham. They didn't even light a candle. I remember thinking that night as I drove home, very slowly, because the roads were icy and my vision isn't what it used to be, that I would not make it to next Christmas in the same way. Something would have to change. Either I'd be dead, or something in this arrangement would snap. There are limits to how much silence a man can endure before it starts to rot the inside of his ribs. When the furnace began to stutter in early January, I saw it as a sign. A warning shot. It made awful sounds, like metal being strangled, and then nothing. Cold silence. I wore 3 layers of flannel and still shivered. I tried to fix it myself. I crouched in front of it with a flashlight and trembling hands, but all I succeeded in doing was bruising my hip on the edge of the workbench. The repairman said it had cost over $4,000 to replace. I considered using my savings, but then I called Jason. I told him what happened. I didn't ask for money, just a place to stay for a few days while I figured things out. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then he said, "Of course, Dad. Come stay with us, just until you get the furnace sorted." His voice was cheerful, a little too cheerful. Sharon even got on the line and said, "We'll make up the guest room, Arnold." I packed a small duffel, just essentials. Medications, toiletries, a couple changes of clothes. I left the house cold and dark, locking the door behind me. I didn't know then that it would be the last time I crossed that threshold as its sole rightful owner. I didn't know that the ground was about to fall out from under me, or that everything I had left, the dignity, the decency, the quiet self-worth I clung to, was about to be tested in ways I had never imagined. I just knew that I was cold, and that I was going to my son's house, and that somewhere, buried deep inside the knot of worry in my chest, was a flicker of relief that maybe, just maybe, I wouldn't be alone for a while. It was a Thursday morning when Jason pulled up to my house in his silver SUV, the one with the heated seats and voice-activated radio that always seemed to confuse me more than it helped. The sky was a flat gray sheet, low and unmoving, and the wind had started to come in bitter, short bursts that sliced through my scarf and stung the corners of my eyes. I stood on the porch with my small duffel bag slung over my shoulder, waiting as Jason honked once, then leaned across the passenger seat to push the door open. I locked the door behind me, triple-checked the handle, and made my way down the icy walkway, careful not to slip. As I climbed into the car, the heater hit me in the face, making my glasses fog up instantly. Jason didn't say much beyond a "Hey, Dad," and a quick glance before pulling back onto the road, his fingers drumming lightly on the steering wheel in a rhythm that sounded less like impatience and more like avoidance. We drove mostly in silence, apart from the sound of the GPS rerouting around road closures caused by the storm. It had snowed steadily for 2 days, and the roads were packed with a crunchy gray slush that made every turn feel precarious. I asked him about the kids, how they were doing in school, if Ava had kept up with her writing, or if Noah still liked outer space. He gave short answers, enough to end each thread. Ava was busy, Noah was fine. Sharon had started working part-time again, some virtual event planning thing that let her run the household on her schedule. I asked if they'd had any issues with the power during the storm, and Jason just said no. The new house was built for Minnesota winters, fully insulated, smart heating system, nothing to worry about. I noticed he didn't ask me anything back. Not about my health, or the house, or even how I'd slept the night before, in what felt like a meat locker. That silence wasn't new. Jason had always been a man who lived inside his own head, but in the past there had been warmth in his quiet. Now it felt more like absence. It wasn't until we pulled into their driveway, a wide, spotless stretch of concrete leading up to their angular, glass-heavy house, that I noticed how small I felt. Not just in size, but in presence. Their home looked like something from a catalog, all neutral tones and polished wood, like it had been designed for pictures rather than people. Sharon was waiting at the front door, her arms crossed over her chest, despite the long, puffy vest she wore over her sweater. She didn't smile when she saw me, just gave a curt nod and turned back into the house, leaving the door open. "Guest room's down in the basement," Jason said as he grabbed my bag from the back seat. "We thought you'd like the privacy. No stairs to deal with once you're down there." I followed him inside, trying not to notice how quickly he walked ahead of me, or how my shoes left wet, muddy prints on their pale hardwood floor. The basement had a steep set of steps, with no railing on one side. I gripped the wall as I descended, each joint in my knees protesting. The room was cold, even colder than I expected, with concrete floors and a single high window that barely let in the light. There was a narrow bed in the corner, already made with a thin comforter, and a small wooden nightstand with a plastic lamp, shaped like a tree branch. A folding chair sat in front of a desk that looked like it had been hastily cleared of boxes. There was no closet, no rug, not even a curtain over the window. "We keep the temperature lower downstairs," Jason explained, placing my bag on the bed. "Thermostat's controlled upstairs. Just text me if you need anything adjusted. Oh, and the bathroom's through that door. But we'd appreciate it if you didn't shower too late. Pipes are noisy, and Sharon's a light sleeper." I nodded, trying not to show how much the chill in the air had already started to creep into my bones. He lingered a moment, then turned and left. The door closed behind him with a soft finality that made me feel like I'd just entered a motel rather than my son's home. I unpacked slowly, methodically, the way I always did. Folded shirts into the single drawer available, lined up my medication bottles on the nightstand, tucked my socks and underwear under the pillow for lack of a better place. I kept my shoes by the wall, their soles still damp. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank wall across from me. There was a hum from the ventilation system, but no warmth came with it. My phone buzzed. A message from Sharon. "Please don't go upstairs unannounced. The kids are doing remote learning, and we don't want distractions." I stared at the screen, then turned the phone off. That night, I ate alone. Jason brought me down a tray of leftovers, some cold chicken breast, a scoop of dry rice, and a bottled water. "We already ate," he said with a shrug. "Just wanted to get the kids settled before bedtime." I thanked him, even smiled, and sat in the folding chair, eating quietly in the artificial light. The bed was stiff, the comforter too thin. I shivered beneath it for hours, even with my socks on. At some point in the night, I got up to use the bathroom and stubbed my toe on the bedpost. When I returned, I noticed my shoes were no longer by the wall. I searched the room. Nothing. I looked in the hall, checked the bathroom. Gone. When I asked Jason about them the next morning, he said, "Oh, Sharon probably moved them upstairs to dry. I'll check later." He never did. The next 3 days passed in that limbo. I stayed downstairs. I read the same library book twice. I listened to the distant sound of footsteps upstairs, laughter, the occasional slam of a cupboard. The kids never came down. I wasn't invited up. Meals were brought to me like room service in a third-rate hotel. Sharon stopped responding to my messages. Jason became scarce. On the fourth morning, a Saturday, Jason knocked on my door. "Hey, Dad, Sharon and I are heading into town. Just a quick trip. Grocery run and some errands. We'll drop you off at the coffee shop for a bit. Let you get out of the house." I agreed. I needed fresh air. even if it was just the stale city kind. I put on the thin windbreaker I'd packed and asked about my shoes. Jason handed me a pair of soft slippers, house shoes, the kind with fuzzy soles and no traction. Sorry, the other ones are soaked through. These will do for now. I wanted to protest, but he was already opening the garage door. The air outside was brutal. The wind ripped through my coat like it wasn't even there. I stepped into the snow and immediately felt the icy sting seep into the slippers. We drove in silence. At some point, Jason turned off the main road and pulled into the parking lot of a strip mall. He parked near the edge, by the dumpsters. "This is good?" he asked. I was confused. There was no coffee shop, just a few darkened storefronts, a pet store, and a laundromat. "Jason, what is this?" He didn't answer. Sharon looked back from the passenger seat, eyes cold. "You'll be fine, Arnold. There's a bus stop over there. Someone will help you." I reached for the door, my hand shaking. "What's going on?" Jason didn't meet my eyes. "We can't do this anymore, Dad. It's not working. You need more care than we can provide. It's too much." The door unlocked with a beep. "We'll check in soon, I promise." And just like that, they were gone. The SUV pulled away, tires spinning on ice, exhaust clouding the air. I stood there in my windbreaker and slippers in a foot of snow, with nothing but my wallet and phone. My feet were already wet. The cold climbed my legs like vines. I didn't move. Not at first, just stood and watched until the car disappeared around the corner. I didn't cry, not then. That came later, when the shock wore off. For now, all I could do was walk, step by frozen step, toward a bench at the bus stop, hoping someone would come before the cold stopped my heart. The snow soaked through the slippers within minutes, rendering my feet numb and heavy. Each step a slow protest against the cruel absurdity of what had just happened. I could feel the wet fleece clinging to my skin, freezing in place, while the wind cut through my windbreaker as if it were made of tissue paper. The strip mall offered no immediate shelter, only shuttered stores, faded signage, and the dull orange glow of security lights that offered no warmth. I sat down on the metal bench by the bus stop, which was crusted with ice, and stared ahead at the empty parking lot, unable to comprehend that my son, my only child, had left me here. I replayed the moment in the car again and again, looking for a sign I had missed, some indication that he was trying to prepare me, that he had struggled with the decision, that this was a moment of weakness and not calculation. But the truth sat in my chest like a stone. They had planned this. This wasn't a sudden act of exasperation or misunderstanding. It was deliberate, methodical, cold in every sense of the word. As cars passed on the main road, I sat shivering, my fingers curled in on themselves, tucked beneath my armpits in a futile attempt to retain heat. I couldn't call a cab because my phone had no battery. I'd forgotten to charge it the night before, lulled by the mechanical rhythms of Jason's basement and the illusion of being under someone's roof. I looked down at my feet and felt a jolt of panic when I saw the skin on my toes turning pale blue. The bench vibrated with each passing gust of wind. I stood up again, telling myself I couldn't wait here, that to sit still any longer would be to invite frostbite or worse. There was a convenience store across the street, its flickering neon open sign like a beacon in the storm. I shuffled toward it, my steps slow and clumsy, leaving two strange, wet paths behind me. The clerk didn't look up when I entered. He was young, maybe 20, bored, scrolling through his phone with earbuds in. I stood for a long time near the hot drink machine, letting the fake heat from the spinning rollers of hot dogs warm my legs while I clutched a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee. I had only $23 in cash on me, and I spent $5 on a pair of dry socks from a discount bin and a banana I couldn't bring myself to eat. I asked the clerk if I could use the phone to call a cab. He pointed to a yellowed payphone near the entrance without removing his earbuds. I hadn't used one in years. I fumbled with the receiver, my fingers stiff, the buttons hard to press. I called 3 companies before one agreed to send someone. I sat by the front door, hugging myself for warmth, my breath forming little ghosts in the air. The cab arrived 40 minutes later. The driver took one look at me, wet, shaking, red-eyed, and said nothing as I climbed into the back seat. I gave him the address of a church downtown that used to run a warming shelter during the worst parts of winter. Darlene and I had donated to it for years. I wasn't sure if it still existed. I didn't know where else to go. When we arrived, I recognized the building immediately, even though it had been over a decade since I'd stepped inside. The exterior was the same, modest brick, with wide wooden doors and a cross that had once been repainted by hand after a hailstorm cracked its surface. The lights were on inside, and when I stepped through the door, warmth hit me like a blessing. A woman at the welcome table looked up and smiled, though her expression shifted subtly when she took in my soaked clothes and slippers. She didn't ask questions. She handed me a towel and a blanket and showed me to a cot in a back room where a few other men sat or slept in silence. I stripped off the wet slippers and socks, inspecting my feet. They were swollen and discolored, but still pink beneath the surface. No black spots, not yet. I wrapped them in the towel and curled up on the cot. I couldn't sleep. My mind played a reel of images, Jason's indifferent eyes, Sharon's stiff posture, the cold interior of their house, the moment the car drove away. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? My son dumped me at a strip mall in the middle of a snowstorm? It would sound pitiful, unbelievable even, and in a way, I was ashamed to have become this fragile thing, a burden, someone others plotted to be rid of. In the morning, I used one of the donated cell phone chargers and managed to revive my phone. Dozens of unread messages from unknown numbers waited, most of them automated spam. Nothing from Jason, nothing from Sharon. I called their home line. It rang once, then went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. What could I say? I checked my bank account, relieved to find my balance unchanged. They hadn't touched anything. Not yet. One of the volunteers, an older man named Marcus, who used to be a nurse, noticed me limping and took a look at my feet. He nodded grimly and said I was lucky. A few more hours outside and I could have lost a toe. He offered to help me get to a clinic, but I declined. I needed to think. I needed a plan. Over the next few days, the shelter staff helped me piece together a temporary sense of normalcy. They gave me clean clothes, simple meals, a pair of worn boots that didn't fit quite right, but kept my feet dry. I found a public library a few blocks away and began using the computers there to look up local resources. I learned that senior legal aid was available through the county, and after a few phone calls and waiting on hold, I made an appointment with a lawyer named Ruth. She agreed to meet me at the shelter the following Monday. Ruth was in her 60s, sharp-eyed and no nonsense. She arrived with a yellow legal pad and a laptop, and she asked careful questions as I told her my story. Every humiliating detail, from the cold basement to the slippers in the snow. When I mentioned the possibility that Jason might have used my name in the purchase of his house, she leaned forward, her pen pausing mid-word. "Do you remember signing anything?" she asked. "Deeds, mortgage documents, financial paperwork." I did. 8 months ago, after a particularly warm Father's Day visit, Jason had said it would help with their refinancing, lower rates, better loan terms. "You'll still be listed as a co-borrower, Dad," he'd said, "but you won't owe anything. It's just paperwork." I'd signed. I hadn't read the fine print. I hadn't even asked for a copy. Ruth sighed and rubbed her temples. "There's a chance," she said, "that you're not just a co-borrower, but a co-owner. That would change things. That would mean you have legal rights to the property." The idea hit me like a thunderclap. The house. The house where I wasn't even allowed upstairs. The house where I was fed like an afterthought and banished to a basement colder than a tomb. I felt something shift inside me. An ember of rage, long dormant, flaring up. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, I felt something sharper than sadness. I felt the beginning of a resolve. Ruth said she'd look into the property records and get back to me within the week. In the meantime, she advised me to avoid contact with Jason and Sharon. "Let them come looking," she said. "They'll have questions when you don't crawl back. They'll assume you're helpless. Let them." The next day, I went to a local barber, got my hair trimmed, my beard neatened. I bought a second-hand coat from a thrift store and used the rest of my cash to rent a room for 2 nights in a small motel near the city center. It wasn't much, but it had heat, and I needed space to think, to rest, to begin reclaiming the parts of myself that had been eroded by silence and shame. I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, studying the face of the man my son had deemed disposable. I didn't see a burden. I saw someone who had been underestimated, who had survived. The first call from Jason came 3 days later. I let it go to voicemail. His voice was light, almost cheerful. "Hey, Dad, just wondering where you went. Thought you were taking a walk, and then, well, we haven't seen you. Give me a ring, okay?" I didn't call back. I didn't need to. The game had changed, and I was no longer playing by their rules. A week passed before I heard from Ruth again, and when her name lit up my phone screen, I was sitting in the corner of a laundromat watching my only remaining set of clothes tumble slowly in a dryer that wheezed like an asthmatic dog. I stepped outside to take the call, the wind biting at my cheeks as I pressed the phone to my ear with fingers still stiff from the cold. Ruth sounded composed, but there was an edge of restrained energy in her voice, the kind that made my breath hitch with anticipation before she even said a word. "I found the deed," she said simply, and then paused, as if letting the silence deepen the weight of her next sentence. "Your name is on it, Arnold. You're not just a co-borrower. You are, in fact, a co-owner of that house, 50%, according to the documents filed with the county registrar. I leaned back against the brick wall of the building, letting the news settle into my bones like heat after frost. Half of the house that had become my prison, half of the home I had paid for, lived outside of, been barred from, and finally discarded by, like spoiled milk. "Are you sure?" I asked, though the question felt like a ghost. Unnecessary, already answered. "It's all there," Ruth said. "Signed, notarized, processed. The only way Jason and Sharon could have removed you was with your explicit written consent, and there's no record of that." She went on to explain the implications. I had rights, I had leverage, and if I wanted to pursue legal separation of ownership, I could force either a buyout or a sale of the entire property. Jason and Sharon couldn't make any decisions about the house without my approval. It felt like standing in the dark and discovering a hidden door I hadn't known to look for. I had power again, and not the kind you beg for or borrow, the kind that comes from fact, from paper, from the law itself. That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake in my motel room, staring at the ceiling fan, watching its slow, lazy rotation, and thinking through everything that had brought me here. The damp slippers, the cold basement, the tray of leftovers, the absurd smile Jason wore when he left me behind, like he was doing me a favor. I thought about Darlene, what she would have said if she'd seen what had become of her family. She had believed in kindness as a foundation, in grace as default. She forgave too easily, I used to think, but now I understood the cost of the alternative. To see clearly is to suffer. And I saw now with the sharpest vision I'd had in years. The next day I took the bus to the edge of the neighborhood where Jason lived. I didn't go to the house. I stood at the corner across from the elementary school, where Ava used to play soccer, and watched children pour out onto the snowy field, their voices sharp and bright in the cold air. None of them noticed me, this old man in a thrifted coat, watching from the periphery. I wasn't there to be seen. I was there to remember, to recalibrate, to understand the exact shape of what had been stolen from me, not just materially, but emotionally, the right to belong, to be acknowledged, to take up space in a home I had helped build, to be part of the world my son had erected from my sacrifices. When I got back to the motel, I called Ruth and told her I wanted to proceed. "I want out," I said. "Not just from the deed. I want to sever everything. Let's see if they'll buy me out. If not, we move to force a sale. I'm done pretending I don't exist." She didn't sound surprised. "I'll draft the first notice. We'll send it certified. That'll get their attention." Then, as if softening, she added, "It's not wrong to want peace, Arnold. Sometimes the only way to get it is by making noise first." I thanked her, hung up, and sat with my thoughts, which didn't comfort me the way I had hoped. I didn't feel triumphant, not yet. What I felt was a heavy sorrow, braided with steel, like mourning mixed with resolve. It wasn't vengeance I wanted. It was dignity. And they had mistaken my silence for surrender. That evening, as I sipped bad motel coffee and watched the sun vanish behind a line of gray roofs, my phone buzzed again. It was Jason. This time I answered. His voice was tighter than before. "Dad, where are you? What the hell's going on?" I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence work on him for a moment before replying. You'll be getting a letter soon. Read it. Then we can talk. He sputtered something, confusion, irritation, disbelief. What letter? What are you talking about? We thought you were dead. Sharon was going to call the police. I smiled at that. Not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. You didn't think I was dead, I said calmly. You thought I wouldn't come back. I hung up before he could respond. That night, for the first time since Darlene's death, I slept through until morning without waking once. The letter Ruth sent was simple and clinical, just as it needed to be, printed on official letterhead and composed in firm but unemotional language that laid out my rights and intentions clearly as co-owner of the property located at 117 Corwin Avenue. I was initiating legal proceedings to divide or sell the house unless a buyout agreement could be reached within 30 days. It was a notice, not a request, a declaration, not a plea. The letter was delivered by certified mail with a return receipt, and Ruth confirmed 2 days later that someone, Sharon most likely, had signed for it. Then we waited. I imagined their reactions the moment they opened the envelope. I imagined the silence at the breakfast table, the panic behind Jason's tightened jaw, Sharon's hissed accusations that he hadn't handled it when he had the chance, the realization spreading between them like ink in water that I hadn't disappeared. Quietly, after all, that I was not the helpless old man they had confidently abandoned in the snow. I imagined them wondering how I'd managed to reemerge, who was helping me, how far I was willing to go, and I hoped that uncertainty clawed at them the way their betrayal had clawed at me in those cold hours on the bus stop bench. 4 days later, Jason called again. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice was clipped, controlled, the voice of a man trying not to reveal how furious he really was. Dad, this letter, what is this? Are you seriously trying to sell our house? I said nothing at first, just waited, because I knew he wasn't done. You can't do this. You signed it over to us. You said it was for the family. Do you remember that? I kept my tone even. I remember signing documents you put in front of me without explaining them. I remember trusting you. He laughed sharply, the kind of laugh that has no humor in it. We're your family. What the hell are you doing? And finally I said, reminding you of that. He sputtered, accusing me of manipulation, of being ungrateful, of overreacting. Then he said something that crystallized everything for me, something I would remember long after his voice faded from the line. This isn't how families work, Dad. You don't sue your son, I replied without raising my voice. Families also don't leave each other standing in snowbanks and house slippers and drive away. After that, communication stopped. I returned to the shelter for a few days, then moved into a small sublet apartment Ruth had helped me find through a local housing agency. 1 room, kitchenette, shared bathroom down the hall, but it was mine, and the key in my pocket felt heavier, with meaning than any front door I had unlocked in years. I began to rebuild a routine slowly. I cooked basic meals, walked to the library in the afternoons, read newspapers from front to back, took long walks around the neighborhood just to remind my body that it still moved under my command. I made a point of speaking to strangers, The clerk at the corner store, the elderly woman who fed pigeons in the park, the bus driver who always nodded at me in the rearview mirror. I reminded myself that I was visible, that I was still here. But even as I carved out a semblance of calm, the other half of my life churned behind the scenes. Ruth had begun assembling the legal paperwork necessary to force the division or sale of the house if Jason and Sharon refused to negotiate. She filed the appropriate notice with the county court, which triggered a series of hearings and deadlines. Jason's response, when it came through his attorney, was a mixture of outrage and desperation. He denied my ownership, despite the clear paperwork. He claimed I had no intention of residing in the home and therefore had no right to profit from it. He said I was mentally confused, easily manipulated, and unfit to make financial decisions. When Ruth showed me the language in his formal rebuttal, I sat for a long time staring at it, rereading phrases that cut deeper than they probably intended to. Mr. Murdoch's deteriorating memory, a history of erratic behavior, vulnerable to undue influence. It was a lie, of course, and a weak one. I had never been diagnosed with anything beyond old-fashioned arthritis. I had no debts, no erratic history, no record of cognitive decline. But it wasn't just the falsehood that stung. It was the ease with which he reached for it, the casual cruelty of choosing to frame me as senile rather than simply wronged. Ruth was unshaken. "It's a tactic," she said, "not an effective one, but common. They're going to try to discredit you because they have no legal standing otherwise, but we'll fight it." I asked what would happen next. "We'll file for a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation to refute the claim. It's standard. You'll meet with a licensed specialist, maybe two. If they find you competent, and they will, the motion collapses." I agreed, not because I needed to prove anything to Jason, but because I refused to let him define the narrative of who I was. I met with two evaluators over the course of 2 weeks, one in a clinical office with an aquarium and pastel walls, the other in a cold municipal building that smelled like floor polish and bureaucracy. They asked me questions about my memory, my finances, the president, the date, the meaning of various proverbs. They asked me to draw a clock, to subtract serial sevens, to recall a list of 5 words after 10 minutes. I did it all, slowly but accurately. I told the truth, clearly and without embellishment. I told them I was angry but not confused. I told them I had been betrayed but not broken. Both doctors wrote glowing evaluations. One even added a handwritten note. Remarkably lucid, strong sense of self, no signs of cognitive impairment. When Ruth received the reports, she forwarded them to Jason's lawyer with a single sentence attached. "We expect a formal withdrawal of your client's motion within 5 business days, or we will pursue damages for defamation and elder abuse." The motion was dropped 2 days later. I thought that would be the end of it, that Jason and Sharon would retreat, forced to concede, too embarrassed to continue, perhaps even a little ashamed. But shame was never their language. 2 weeks later, I received a voicemail. "Sharon, brittle and theatrical. Arnold, I don't know what game you're playing, but you're destroying your family. We took you in, we fed you. We gave you a place to live. And this is how you repay us? You want to take away our children's home? You want to ruin Jason's credit? This is elder revenge, and it's cruel. Please think about what you're doing before it's too late. I listened to the message 3 times, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to memorize the cadence of her voice, the way she layered lies with guilt, the way she weaponized the word family like a blade disguised as an olive branch. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. The courts would answer for me. In the meantime, Ruth had been in touch with a real estate agent, a calm, soft-spoken woman named Denise, who specialized in contested sales. She conducted a preliminary valuation of the house and estimated its market value at just over $640,000. My half, after taxes and fees, would be around $310,000, a sum that would allow me to live comfortably for the rest of my life, perhaps even travel, perhaps even, though the thought was still distant, consider moving into a senior community, not out of necessity, but by choice. A place with windows and warm light and people who ask questions, not out of obligation, but curiosity. A place where no one would leave me in the snow. Jason and Sharon refused the buyout proposal Ruth submitted. They claimed they didn't have the funds. They didn't make a counteroffer. They didn't acknowledge the appraisal. They just said no. That's when we filed for forced partition. The process began to move faster then. The court saw the documentation, acknowledged my rights, and scheduled a hearing date. Jason's lawyer tried one last maneuver, proposing that I sign over my share in exchange for a monthly stipend. I declined. I didn't want an allowance. I wanted closure. I wanted the door to be locked behind me once and for all. The day of the hearing, I wore the best clothes I had. A wool sweater Darlene had given me one Christmas, a pair of slacks that no longer fit quite right, but still held their shape, shoes I had polished until they looked newer than they were. I arrived at the courthouse early and sat in the hallway outside the chamber, watching the slow parade of people come and go, couples dissolving marriages, landlords evicting tenants, families sorting through the wreckage of inheritances and grudges. When our case was called, I entered the room behind Ruth and sat beside her as the judge reviewed the file. Jason was there, seated next to his lawyer, pale and stiff, avoiding my eyes. Sharon was absent. The judge read through the documents, asked a few clarifying questions, and then said, almost casually, "It appears that Mr. Murdoch's ownership is uncontested and supported by the deed. Given the breakdown in communication and lack of agreement on buyout terms, the court will approve the petition for partition by sale." That was it. No drama, no shouting, just a sentence that closed a chapter decades long. Jason said nothing. He didn't even flinch. I didn't look at him when I left the room. I didn't need to. I had already seen everything I needed to see. That night, I returned to my apartment and sat by the window, watching the slow drift of snow under the streetlight. I thought about what Darlene would have said, what she would have made of all this. I thought about how strange it was to find myself at 81, no longer trying to be a good father, but merely a man protecting what little of himself remained. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel righteous. I felt tired. But beneath that exhaustion was something steadier than triumph. It was the knowledge that I had not disappeared, that I had not allowed myself to be erased, that I had refused to vanish just because it would have been easier for someone else if I had. The notice of sale was posted on the county's public listings within 2 weeks of the court ruling, and I was copied on every formal document, every procedural update, every appraisal confirmation, and notice of inspection. Denise, the real estate agent, handled the logistics with the same cool professionalism she had demonstrated from the start, sending me updates by email and sometimes calling to let me know if there had been any resistance from Jason and Sharon. During the walkthroughs, there was resistance, of course. Sharon refused to leave the house during the first visit, and at one point tried to sabotage the staging process by removing light bulbs from every major room and dragging a garbage bag full of children's clothes into the middle of the living room floor. But Denise wasn't rattled. She calmly rescheduled, brought her own bulbs, and returned with a photographer who had seen worse. The house, once stripped of their curated decor, an unearned veneer of family warmth, was surprisingly sterile. It photographed well, but not lovingly. It looked like a place where no one ever really laughed, where dinner was eaten out of obligation, where silence pressed against the walls, heavier than sound ever could. The listing went live on a Thursday morning, and by that afternoon, 3 offers had come in. The market was hot, and the location, close to a good school district, near public transit, newer build, did most of the work. By the end of the week, 1 offer stood out. A young couple expecting their first child, offered slightly over asking, no contingencies, and a 30-day close. It was ideal. Denise presented it to Ruth and me with a kind of grim satisfaction. Ruth filed the final paperwork with the court, and within days the sale was locked in, irreversible. Jason was notified through his attorney. He never responded directly to me. Not a call, not a message, not a word. But I imagined what the silence contained, a storm of disbelief, bitterness, perhaps fear. He had built his adult life on the assumption that I would fade away quietly. I had refused. Now he would have to explain to his children why they were packing boxes, why the only house they had ever known was no longer theirs. I wondered if he would blame me, or if he would spin the truth into something softer for them. Maybe say that I'd sold it behind his back. Maybe say that I had mental issues or debts, or that I had never truly been part of their family. He could craft whatever narrative he wanted. I had stopped caring what he said when I realized he never cared how I felt. The day of the move came, and though I wasn't legally required to be there, I went anyway. Not to gloat, not even to watch, but to see with my own eyes the final unraveling, the physical dismantling of the world that had treated me like refuse. I stood across the street, leaning against a telephone pole, wrapped in a heavy coat and scarf, and watched as a rental truck backed into the driveway. Sharon came out first, wearing sunglasses despite the gray sky. She barked instructions at the movers with clipped frustration. Jason emerged a few minutes later, carrying boxes, his face expressionless. The children weren't there, probably with friends or relatives, kept away from the spectacle of defeat. They didn't see their father shrink 2 inches in posture. They didn't see their mother weep behind the front door after the movers took the television. They didn't see the house emptied, corner by corner, until it no longer resembled a home, only a structure. I didn't stay long. I didn't need to. I had seen what I came to see, not revenge, but consequence. I walked back to the bus stop with no hurry in my step. That night, in my small apartment, I opened a bottle of root beer, Darlene's favorite, and toasted the photograph of her that sat by my bed. I told her everything, though she already knew. I told her how I had nearly given up, how I had stood outside in slippers while our son erased us, how I had chosen not to disappear. I told her the house was sold. I told her I didn't feel triumphant. I told her I felt clean. The check came 10 days after the closing, $314,827.45 after deductions and fees. Ruth delivered it to me in person, smiling with a kind of quiet pride that lawyers probably aren't supposed to show. "Spend it however you want," she said. "You earned every cent." I thought about that. Not just the money, but what it meant to earn it. Not in the way one earns a wage, but in the way one earns their story. I thought about how easily the elderly are pushed aside, their lives reduced to inconveniences, their memories treated as clutter, their authority rewritten by people who believe that technology or education or newness entitles them to absolute control. I had been forgotten, devalued, dismissed. But I had not become invisible. I deposited the check the next day. I paid off every remaining bill I had. I bought a new mattress, one that didn't remember someone else's shape. I bought a set of winter boots that cost more than any pair of shoes I had ever owned. I signed a lease on a small unit in a senior living complex just outside the city, a place with a view of a pond and a library and a small greenhouse where residents could grow herbs and tomatoes if their hands still allowed it. I moved in at the start of spring, as the last of the snow melted into the sidewalks and the days began to stretch just a little longer. No one there knew my story. I didn't offer it unless asked. I let them meet me as I was, a quiet man, steady, polite, with good boots and clear eyes. I received one final letter from Jason. It was short, handwritten, surprisingly neat. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply said, "I hope you're happy. We're staying with Sharon's sister for now. The kids don't understand what happened. I don't know if they ever will." I folded the letter and put it in a drawer, not out of sentiment, but documentation. Evidence that I had not imagined it all. That summer, I sat under the pergola outside my building watching a family of ducks cross the footpath by the pond, and I thought, not for the first time, that maybe the greatest act of survival isn't endurance, but refusal. Refusal to be rewritten. Refusal to be cast as irrelevant. Refusal to vanish for someone else's convenience. The seasons turned without ceremony, and by the time autumn colored the trees around the senior complex in the deep shades of rust and gold, I had begun to settle into something that resembled peace, though not the kind that comes with forgetting. My days were simple now, structured by soft routines and small comforts. Morning walks by the pond with a thermos of weak coffee, afternoon chess games in the common room with a retired pharmacist named George who spoke more to the pieces than to me, and quiet evenings in my unit with a paperback and the gentle rattle of wind brushing against the windows. I didn't speak often about what had happened, not because I was ashamed, but because the shape of it lived in me now. Not as a wound, but as a scar, the kind that doesn't ache anymore, but changes the way you move. People here respected silence. They understood that most of us had stories buried under our ribs that we only unearthed if someone asked the right question in the right tone at the right time. I didn't hear from Jason again, not after the letter, not after the sale, not after I sent a brief response that said only, "I hope the kids remember who I was before they were told who I wasn't." He never replied. I didn't expect him to. He had made his choice, and I had made mine, and the path between us now was more overgrown than I had the strength or desire to clear. I sometimes wondered what he told Ava and Noah, what version of me existed in their minds now. If I had become the bitter old man who'd taken away their home, if Sharon had crafted a story where I was unstable or vindictive, maybe it didn't matter. Maybe the truth of me would survive in some other form, if not in memory, than in the quiet integrity of what I refused to become. The last time I saw Noah, he had drawn me a picture, a crooked house with smoke curling from the chimney and a smiling figure waving from the porch. I had folded it and put it in my coat pocket. I still carried it sometimes, creased and soft at the corners. It reminded me that once, even briefly, someone had seen me as belonging somewhere. One afternoon in late October, as the sky turned prematurely dark and a cold wind teased the first promise of snow, I received a letter in a small, unmarked envelope. The handwriting was careful, young. Inside was a folded piece of lined paper and a drawing. Another house, but this one surrounded by tall trees with a bench out front and ducks near a pond. The letter was from Noah. "Dear Grandpa," it said, "I don't know why we don't see you anymore. Mom says you live far away now. I hope your feet aren't cold. I miss the way your house smelled like wood. I hope you have someone to play cards with. I miss you. Love, Noah." I read it twice, then sat very still, holding the paper like it was something holy. I didn't cry. I had done enough of that, but I felt something warm move through me, something gentle and painful, all at once. Children remember more than we think. They feel the spaces adults try to plaster over with lies. I didn't write back. Not yet. I didn't want to send a letter that would be intercepted or distorted, but I kept his in my drawer beside Darlene's photograph and the deed papers, a small archive of the truths that still mattered. Maybe one day, when he was old enough, I'd find him. I'd give him the whole story. Not out of spite, not to poison him against his parents, but to give him the gift I had fought so hard to reclaim for myself, clarity and the power to decide for himself who I was. As winter returned, I walked slower, sat longer, spoke less, not out of sadness, but because I had learned that a man doesn't need to fill the air to remain present. I had been cast out, discarded, forgotten, but I had not vanished. I had stood up in the cold, with nothing on my feet but soaked fabric and memory, and walked back into the world. I had drawn a line, and I had watched it hold. That was enough. That was everything.